remarkable individual. You know, the last 30 years of his life, he was sort of unspoken, but he'd said all he needed to say before then. And he's just such a great person in every way, and we are deeply privileged as boxers to have him in our sport.
What was he like as a person to talk to face to face?
Yeah, I remember him, to be perfectly honest, he had already sort of slipped into his sickness when I met him in the flesh in the early 1980s. The onset of Parkinson's had already begun, and you could see it, and it was noticeable. But I was a massive fan of his over the years, and I'd followed him really from the early 1970s. My father met him when he came to fight Al Blue Lewis in Dublin in 1972, I think it was 1971. In 1972, actually. So, and he was just transfixed with him and said he was just hugely impressive. And you know, I had followed him from, as I say, the early 1970s, and of course I read up about what he'd done and all of the things that he'd done before that. So, you know, the imprint that he's made on boxing, the imprint that he's made on individuals with his efforts with the civil rights movement and the Vietnam issue and all of that was you know, in the Rumble in the Jungle and the Thriller in Manila and all those great fights that he had, and how outspoken he was during the Vietnam War. They turned out to be exactly right, the decisions he made. You know, he was just a phenomenal individual, and again, as I keep repeating, we were just cherished the fact that he chose boxing as opposed to another sport, or as opposed to another occupation.
Barry, you've written in the past that he was the first athlete of the world to understand the power of sport in a television age. How important was that, do you think?
I think, Marion, it was a perfect confluence, because he came along at a time when we had terrestrial TV, which reached into the corners of the world that no other medium had reached before. He was so articulate. He was so powerful to look at and watch. He was so handsome. He always seemed to say the right thing. It was diatribe at times, and you know, initially people didn't always like him, but nobody ever ignored him. He was, you know, he was so, you just couldn't take your eyes off him. He was so good looking, so amazingly articulate, and all of the things that he said were so powerful, and it was at a hugely time in history. So he just happened to be around at the right time. He just happened to be one of the greatest orators that there's ever been, and the message that he put across was hugely powerful. And he was just you know, an amazing human being. He was just a really hugely charismatic, wonderful individual.
You're a boxer, obviously, a former professional boxer. Which of his fights do you think were the greatest?
Well, we can go on and on. The Rumble in the Jungle, the Thriller in Manila against against Joe Frazier, the Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman, coming back as a relatively old man and winning the title against probably the most fearsome heavyweight in heavyweight history, George Foreman. But probably the greatest fight of all was his return after 4 years of isolation, and the fight in the Madison Square Garden in 1971 against Joe Frazier, who was the lineal champion. It was probably one of the greatest fights that there's ever been. And at that time, he wasn't well liked in America because he refused to go to Vietnam. He said all those things that only a black man could say. But he was outspoken and he wasn't that well liked, and so he had to win the people over. But the way he did it was, first of all, a phenomenal performance in the ring against Frazier, and then after that, of course, just sticking to his guns and turning the populace around in America at a time when things were very, very political.